you drift over the line back there, sir?
Avoiding a pothole, officer. I maintain control of the vehicle.
Do you have any weapons, and do you consent to a search of your truck?
The dust hadn't even settled on the sun-baked shoulder of County Route 119 before Officer David Miller's hand was already resting unconsciously against the grip of his holster. It was supposed to be a routine traffic stop for a minor lane violation. But the suffocating July heat seemed to thicken the air with a sudden, unearned tension that was about to unravel everything Miller thought he knew about police work. The rural stretch of highway in Oak Haven County was a lonely ribbon of asphalt flanked by overgrown dry grass and dense, looming pine trees. It was late afternoon, the kind of heavy, golden hour where the light plays tricks on the eyes and the deafening hum of cicadas drowns out everything but your own heartbeat. Marcus Tate had driven this road 100 times, a 42-year-old logistics coordinator at the nearby agricultural depot. Marcus was just a man trying to get home after a grueling 10-hour shift. He was driving his 15-year-old Ford F-150, a sturdy, faded blue machine that rattled over the uneven pavement. A few miles back, Marcus had momentarily allowed his right tire to drift over the solid white fog line to avoid a deep, jagged pothole that threatened to tear up his suspension. It was a fleeting maneuver, a basic defensive driving instinct, but in the rearview mirror, the momentary drift caught the eye of Officer Miller, who was parked in the shadow of a dilapidated billboard, running radar. When the flashing red and blue lights ignited behind him, Marcus didn't panic. He didn't curse or slam his hands against the steering wheel. He simply checked his mirrors, activated his turn signal, and smoothly guided his heavy truck onto the loose gravel shoulder, bringing it to a gentle, controlled stop. As the engine ticked and cooled, Marcus went through a mental checklist honed by 2 decades of military service. He was a retired Army veteran. Having spent years managing high-stress deployments in volatile environments, he knew the drill. Even before the cruiser's door opened, Marcus turned off his engine, pulled the keys from the ignition, and placed them visibly on the cracked dashboard. He rolled down all 4 windows to remove any blind spots for the approaching officer, turned on his dome light despite the fading daylight outside, and placed both of his large, calloused hands squarely at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. He sat perfectly still, breathing evenly, his posture relaxed but highly alert. In the patrol car behind him, Officer Miller was operating on a completely different frequency at 28. Miller was a 6-year veteran of the Sheriff's Department, deeply entrenched in a culture that praised proactive, aggressive policing. The county had recently seen a spike in property crimes and rural drug trafficking, and the pressure from command to make meaningful stops was a heavy weight on Miller's shoulders. He was looking for the big bust. The career-making interdiction that started from a simple traffic violation to Miller, everyone was a potential suspect. And every minor infraction was just a pretext to dig deeper. As he ran Marcus's slightly dusty license plate through the system, his mind was already building a narrative. The truck was old. It was kicking up too much dust. The driver hadn't pulled over fast enough, taking an extra 100 yards to find a safe shoulder. It was all minor. But through the lens of Miller's confirmation bias, it painted a picture of someone trying to buy time. Miller stepped out of his cruiser, the crunch of his heavy black boots loud against the gravel. He didn't walk directly to the driver's window. Instead, he took a wide angle, touching the rear taillight of Marcus's truck, a habit ingrained from the academy to leave fingerprints in case the officer went missing. He unclipped his flashlight, even though the sun was still bleeding over the horizon, and shined the harsh beam directly into the cab, sweeping across the empty back seat, the cluttered floorboards, and finally into the rearview mirror. Trying to catch Marcus's eyes. "Good evening," Marcus said evenly, his voice a low, steady rumble that barely carried over the ambient noise of the highway. He didn't turn his head sharply, maintaining his forward gaze while keeping his hands firmly planted on the wheel. driver's license, registration, and proof of insurance, Miller demanded. His tone was brisk, devoid of the standard conversational pleasantries that usually accompanied a minor infraction. He stood slightly behind the B-pillar of the truck, angling his body defensively, his hand still resting instinctively near his duty weapon. "They are in the glove compartment, officer," Marcus replied, his words slow and deliberate. "I will need to reach across with my right hand to open it. My left hand will remain on the steering wheel. Is that all right?" Miller narrowed his eyes. The extreme politeness, the over-explanation of movements, it rubbed him the wrong way. In Miller's experience, people who were pulled over were usually flustered, annoyed, or anxious. They fumbled for their wallets. They complained about the speed limit. They made excuses. Marcus was none of these things. His breathing was too calm, his affect entirely flat. To an officer trained to view anxiety as a sign of deception, an absolute lack of anxiety was somehow perceived as even more suspicious. Miller interpreted Marcus's rigid adherence to protocol not as respect, but as a calculated practice routine of a criminal trying to hide something. "Just get the documents." Miller snapped, shining the light directly into Marcus's eyes. A subtle exertion of dominance, Marcus blinked against the glare but didn't flinch. Slowly, mechanically, he moved his right hand, opened the glove compartment, retrieved a small leather folio, and handed the requested cards out the window. "Here you go." Miller snatched the cards. "Do you know why I pulled you over? I imagine it was because my passenger side tire crossed the fog line back near the mile marker." Marcus said cleanly, "There was a significant depression in the asphalt. I adjusted to avoid vehicle damage." "You were swerving," Miller corrected, his voice hardening. "People who swerve are usually distracted or impaired." "Where are you coming from?" "Work, the agricultural depot on Route 9. "Where are you heading?" Home." "And where is home?" Marcus recited his address, a quiet subdivision just outside the county line. The interaction should have ended there. A warning or a citation for failure to maintain a lane, taking no more than 10 minutes. Miller walked back to his cruiser and ran the information. Marcus Tate. Clean record. Valid license. No warrants. No flags. The system offered absolutely no justification to view this man as a threat or a suspect. But sitting in the air-conditioned cab of his patrol car, Miller couldn't shake the itch in his gut. The guy was too calm. The truck was too messy. It was the kind of unsubstantiated hunch that officers often confuse for instinct. Miller decided he wasn't going to just write a ticket. He was going to push. When Miller returned to the truck, he didn't have a citation book in his hand. "Mr. Tate, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle," Miller said, his tone shifting from authoritative to commanding. Inside the cab, Marcus's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He knew the law. He understood that under Pennsylvania v. MIMS, an officer has the right to order a driver out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. But he also understood the subtle, dangerous shift occurring in the dynamic. This was no longer about a tire crossing a white line. This was a fishing expedition. "Am I receiving a citation?" Officer Marcus asked, his voice remaining terrifyingly neutral. "Step out of the truck." "Mr. Tate." "Now, I am complying," Marcus said, raising both hands to shoulder height before using his left hand to pull the door handle. He stepped out onto the uneven gravel, standing at 6'2", broad-shouldered and solid. Marcus towered over the slightly shorter officer, yet his posture remained deliberately non-threatening. He kept his hands visible, interlacing his fingers and resting them on top of his own head without being asked, "Turn around and face the truck." Miller ordered, taking a step back, his hand firmly on his holster. "Now, The sudden physical presence of the larger man had spiked Miller's adrenaline, justifying his own internal narrative that he was in danger. "Spread your feet, officer," Marcus said calmly, facing the chipped paint of his truck. "Emi on arrest, you're being detained." Miller replied tightly. He stepped forward and grabbed Marcus's left hand, pulling it down behind his back. "For what suspected crime?" Marcus asked. "I'm conducting a Terry pat-down for my own safety," Miller said, his voice laced with the breathless edge of a man who knows he is pushing a boundary. "You're acting nervous. Your behavior is erratic." "I have been entirely compliant," Marcus stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am not armed. I have given you no reasonable, articulable suspicion to believe I am armed and dangerous. You are extending a minor traffic stop without probable cause." The precise clinical use of legal terminology hit Miller like a physical blow. The sudden introduction of phrases like reasonable, articulable suspicion from a dusty driver on a rural highway shattered Miller's script. Instead of backing down, Miller doubled down, his ego bruising. He roughly patted down the outside of Marcus's heavy canvas work pants. Feeling for the distinct hard lines of a weapon, he found nothing but a wallet, a set of keys, and a cell phone. "No weapons, no contraband, nothing. I'm going to call for a K9 unit to do an open-air sniff of your vehicle," Miller announced, stepping back but keeping Marcus positioned against the truck. "Under Rodriguez V, United States," Marcus replied to the metal side of his truck, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet evening air. "You cannot prolong a traffic stop beyond the time reasonably required to complete the mission of issuing a ticket for the initial violation, unless you have independent, reasonable suspicion of a secondary crime, which you do not." Silence fell over the side of the road, broken only by the distant, lonely howl of a tractor trailer miles away. Miller stared at the back of Marcus's head, a cold sweat breaking out under his uniform collar. He had assumed Marcus was uneducated, easily intimidated, a passive participant in a power dynamic. Miller controlled. He had profiled him not necessarily by the color of his skin, though the implicit biases of race and class were woven deeply into the fabric of the assumption, but by a holistic, flawed calculation of the man's vehicle, his demeanor, and his geographic location. Miller had taken a man's stoic dignity and criminalized it. Before Miller could formulate a response to the constitutional wall he had just slammed into, a second set of headlights swept over them. A heavy SUV pulled onto the shoulder, kicking up a fresh cloud of dust. It was Sergeant Hayes, Miller's shift supervisor. Hayes was 20 years older, his uniform slightly rumpled, his demeanor shaped by decades of mediating the exact kind of mess Miller was currently creating. Hayes stepped out, his eyes instantly taking in the scene. He saw a compliant citizen facing a vehicle, no weapons drawn, no visible threat, and his junior officer looking uncharacteristically flushed and uncertain. "Everything all right here?" Miller Hayes asked, his voice a gravelly, calm anchor in the tension. "Got a failure to maintain lane, Sarge," Miller said, trying to sound authoritative, but failing to hide the slight tremor of adrenaline. Driver was acting evasive, unusually stiff. "I pulled him out for a pat down. Was just about to call for a dog." Hayes walked closer, his eyes studying Marcus, who remained perfectly still, hands still resting on the truck. "You find anything on the pat down?" "Negative." Hayes looked at Marcus. "You can turn around, Sir. Keep your hands where I can see them. But you can relax." Marcus turned slowly. He looked directly at the sergeant. "Good evening, Sergeant. My name is Marcus Tate. I am a retired master sergeant, United States Army Military Police Corps. I am currently the logistics coordinator at the Fort Campbell Annex." Miller's stomach dropped into his boots. "Sergeant," Marcus continued, his voice finally carrying a subtle, razor-sharp edge of authority. Your officer pulled me over for a minor, unavoidable lane drift. I complied fully. I provided my documents. Your officer then ordered me out of my vehicle, subjected me to an unwarranted Terry frisk without a single articulable fact to suggest I was armed and dangerous, and threatened to illegally prolong my detention for a K-9 unit purely because he felt my calm demeanor was, quote, nervous behavior. Hayes closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. A silent, painful acknowledgement of a colossal procedural failure. He knew Miller. He knew the young officer's aggressive tendencies, his over-reliance on gut feelings, and his poor grasp of Fourth Amendment boundaries. Furthermore, Marcus said, gesturing slightly with his chin toward the interior of his cab, I have a high-definition, dual-lens dash camera mounted behind my rearview mirror. It records both audio and video, forward-facing and interior. It has captured the entirety of this interaction, including the officer's lack of reasonable suspicion, his statements regarding my behavior, and his physical search of my person. The silence that followed was absolute. The power dynamic on the side of that dusty road didn't just shift, it inverted completely. There was no screaming. There was no physical altercation. There was only the devastating, undeniable weight of procedural incompetence dragged out into the glaring light of evidence. Sergeant Hayes turned to Miller. The look he gave the younger officer wasn't angry. It was intensely disappointed. It was the look of a supervisor realizing that a liability had just been fully exposed. Go sit in your cruiser. Miller, Hayes said quietly, Sarge, go sit in your cruiser. Now, Miller swallowed hard, his face burning with a mixture of humiliation and dawning realization. He turned and walked back to his patrol car, his boots dragging in the gravel, the bravado completely drained from his posture. He climbed inside and shut the heavy door, sealing himself in the quiet, suffocating air conditioning. Hayes turned back to Marcus. Mr. Tate, I apologize for the inconvenience and the nature of this stop. I am going to return your documents. You are free to go. No citation will be issued. I appreciate that, Sergeant, Marcus said, lowering his hands and finally rolling his shoulders, the physical tension leaving his body in a long, quiet exhale. But we both know this isn't about a citation anymore. I understand, Hayes said softly. I will be reviewing the body camera footage from Officer Miller before the end of shift tonight. And I will be requesting a copy of that footage through the county clerk's office on Monday morning to accompany my formal complaint to Internal Affairs. Marcus stated firmly, yet politely, this wasn't police work. Sergeant, this was profiling dressed up as officer safety. If I hadn't known my rights, if I hadn't maintained absolute tactical composure, your officer's unchecked assumptions could have escalated this into a tragedy. He operates on fear, not facts. You have every right to file that complaint. Sir, Hayes admitted, his voice heavy with the grim reality of the administrative nightmare and the necessary accountability that awaited him. Have a safe drive home. Marcus nodded respectfully. He got back into his truck, started the engine, and pulled seamlessly back onto the highway. The taillights fading into the gathering dusk, the fallout was neither instantaneous nor highly dramatized by the media. Real life rarely offers the explosive, immediate justice of television. Instead, the consequences unfolded in the quiet, sterile environments of administrative offices. On Monday, Marcus filed his complaint, providing his dash cam footage by Wednesday. Officer Miller was quietly stripped of his patrol duties and placed on administrative desk work pending a full departmental review. He sat under the flickering fluorescent lights of the precinct basement, filing reports, stripped of his badge and gun, forced to confront the harsh reality that his assumptions, his deeply ingrained biases about how compliance should look, who belonged, where, and what constituted a threat had catastrophically failed him. The investigation would eventually result in a lengthy suspension, mandatory retraining on constitutional law, and a permanent, glaring stain on his personnel file that would follow him for the rest of his career. He had let his subjective fear override objective law. The incident left no physical scars, but it lingered as a chilling testament to the fragile nature of freedom on an open road. It revealed how quickly the shield of authority can become a weapon of assumption, and how the line between a routine stop and a violation of civil liberties is often as thin as a white fog line painted on cracked asphalt. When a badge is backed by bias rather than evidence, who is actually protecting whom, and what happens to the citizens who don't have the training, the cameras, or the composure to survive the fear of the very people sworn to protect them,